Welcome to Neurodivergency, where neurodivergent voices and friends turn struggle into strength. We're here to break the stigma around mental health, dive into the truth about our brains, and bring you real tools for clarity, healing, and hope. Today's guest is Dr. Jenny Hale, who is a research supervisor and emotional intelligence expert. Welcome to the show, Jenny.
Thanks for having me, Anthony.
Such a pleasure. So tell us a bit what brings you here.
Well, oh, where to start? Um, I figured out pretty quickly when I started teaching people emotional intelligence skills that a large proportion of the people who were coming to me had some form of neurodivergence. Um, so in some cases, it was trauma and developmental trauma. In some cases, it was more classic neurodivergence, like having ADHD or autism or both. And of course, a lot of people, if you grow up neurodivergent, you kind of get traumatized on the way because the world is not geared to meet the needs of neurodivergent. It wasn't when we all were growing up. So I ended up having to do a deep dive myself into how to make the regular non really effective and applicable for people with neurodivergence so that they could get the benefit from training and developing their emotional intelligence skills.
Okay, interesting. And
And I guess why I'm here on the
how?
podcast is because I saw
Yeah.
you were doing it and I was like, that's a great idea.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for coming here. It's really a pleasure to have you share your story and your expertise. I'm curious to know if you have a personal relationship with neurodivergence or a story of struggling where the things that you learned up until today have helped you uh, get through those struggles.
Well, yes, many. That was one of the interesting things that happened along the way with my work is that I came to realize more and more of my friends and the people close to me were also neurodivergent. And eventually I took the RADS-R test, which is an online screening test, and scored well into the autism range myself. Um, so I've not gone and got a diagnosis because it costs thousands of dollars and there's not really much benefit to me in having a medical diagnosis. And I don't consider that it's important because my philosophy has always been every individual is an individual, and
Yeah.
the approach that I take with any given person has to be tailored to that person. So the fact that there's a label you can put on some aspects of a person, whether it's ADHD or autism or whatever, is not that significant to me. But it did give me a bit of kind of permission to mask a bit less because I always grew up feeling like the absolute worst sin you could possibly commit was to be a bother and to spoil things for everybody. And
Hmm.
so I spent my whole life just trying not to make a fuss. And once I realized that my neurology might actually be different from other people's, and I might genuinely be suffering more from certain things and actually more sensitive to things than other people, then I gave myself permission to do things like avoiding crowded and noisy places and living somewhere that's very quiet and asking people to turn things down or turn things off and stuff like that. And over time, as I started to be less stressed because my environment was better for me, I started to realize that one of the reasons why I hadn't really noticed the autism was because I had quite a few ADHD characteristics as well. And they only came out when I got less stressed. Um, so, because, stress Adrenaline is one great way to suppress your ADHD symptoms a bit. And in the process, my husband has been diagnosed with ADHD, and in another couple of weeks, he's got his appointment to get an official diagnosis of autism. And two of my daughters have been diagnosed with ADHD, and so yeah, I feel like I'm very much surrounded by neurodivergence. In fact, when one of my daughters took the RADS-R test herself, she said, "Oh, I think this test is bullshit." She said, "No one could ever possibly score less than 65 on this test." And then her boyfriend took it, and he only scored 18.
Oh, wow.
But he's got ADHD, but clearly not autism. So it does measure something because there are some people
Yeah.
who get less than 65 on that test. But most of my circles, my family and my friends, all have some form of neurodivergence.
Interesting. Yeah, I seek out a lot of these online and psychological kind of self-assessments, and I've never heard about the RADS-R, so I definitely will be checking that out. Um, when
Yeah,
did
it's
you,
the
yeah, go ahead.
RAAD, all in capitals, and then a small s hyphen small r. And the best place to do it is on the Embrace Autism website. So it's embrace-autism,
Super.
because it's free there. And there are some people who've grabbed it and put it up with a paywall on it, which I think is ridiculous. But at Embrace Autism, you can do it for free.
Wow, yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that excellent resource right off the bat. I'm curious to know, when did you take that test for the first time in your journey? I'd love to kind of have an overall view of the timeline of your life as it relates to neurodivergence and the big milestones that led you to where you are today.
Well, so I thought I was completely average and normal until I had a burnout at 37. And that's when I realized I had uh, complex PTSD and developmental trauma. And I then had to learn all my emotional intelligence skills in order to recover from that and be able to function in some way other than as an adrenaline fueled workaholic. And then I was working in that sort of way for a long time, uh, nearly 20 years. No, maybe 15 years, before I started to wonder whether I might be neurodivergent. So I don't remember exactly when I took the RADS-R test the first time, but I do know it was well before my daughter's wedding, because at my daughter's wedding, all my teenage nieces and nephews were pulling out their smartphones and taking the test during the reception, because one of them had told the others about it, and they all wanted to know.
Wow. Yeah, that's really powerful, sharing about the burnout in your 30s and the complex PTSD. It's it's not surprising to me to hear that there are these other intersections of labels and experiences that happened in the mix, and it just reinforces this perspective I have that mental health and mental well-being is just so complex and so many factors are influencing it. It's really hard to tell, kind of what causes what and what are the reasons behind anything. And given that you also had this burnout experience in your late 30s, I I'm assuming that you'd already had quite some career development and some substantial training before that point, even. I'd love to hear a bit more about that.
Well, that was my corporate era. So I was working as a business consultant and executive coach in high-powered, project-based transformation and change types of situations. So I was running on adrenaline the whole time. I was a type A. Every time I did some personal development and I got more capable, I would just take on more stuff. So I was always like right on the edge. And eventually there was just a combination of circumstances that meant I couldn't take a break when I needed one, and that's what tipped me into burnout. but it was unsustainable as a lifestyle. And one of the things I remember from that time, I was I was with a friend of mine who had finally recognized she was also a workaholic, but she was using um, uppers and downers to get through. So she would take a stimulant in the morning and work out for a couple of hours, and then take a sleeping tablet at night to be able to sleep. And she'd been told by a doctor that she was basically destroying her heart, and she had to stop with this. So she was checking herself into rehab, and I was there, like supporting her, and she was in between negotiating with the nurse about what kind of sleeping tablets she could get that night. She was telling me where she'd hidden tablets around the apartment so that I could text her fiance to them before she came out of rehab. And while I was watching this happening, I realized that I had this really weird feeling, and I realized that it was actually what I was feeling was envy. It was like she gets to stop for 3 weeks and just rethink her life, and like the food's handled and the laundry's handled and everything's handled, and all she has to think about is herself. I was like, you have to be addicted to substances in order to have 3 weeks off and rethink your life. And so as I walked away, I was thinking that must be some kind of warning, and maybe like not take another contract, not do anything for money until I figure out what's actually really authentic for me and is going to be
Yeah.
called and offered me just a 2 months fill-in role, like for a manager of a government department who got sick. And oh, well, 8 weeks I can do that. And then it turned out that he'd been sick for a while and everything was a complete mess and they had to retire him. And it was a year before they found a replacement. And by the time that year was up, I was in burnout. So I had the warning. Like I recognized the warning at the time,
Uh-huh.
but I still didn't stop.
Yeah.
I was an adrenaline junkie. I was just as much of a junkie as my friend, but it wasn't an addiction that was recognized, and it wasn't an addiction I could go to rehab for.
Yeah, it's
So my
it's
body gave me
crazy.
rehab, you know.
Yeah.
It just my
Yeah.
body just shut down and went, nope, you're stopping now.
Yeah, that is the threshold of burnout doing its thing. I think a lot of people are on the burnout spectrum, probably really close to burnout, either if it's one more project or one more life event of chaos and craziness is all it takes
Mm-hmm.
to really go over the edge.
Mm-hmm.
But but these people are totally unaware or coping with it in their learned strategies. I know I'm probably on that right now, or I certainly have a tendency to be on that spectrum, and I can see it in my hands when I have a flare up of eczema. It's like, oh, I'm taking on too much stress right now. I need to like
Mm-hmm.
slow down. So thankfully, I've never had the
Mm-hmm.
burnout to go over the edge, but I'm sure I'm in the working up to burnout zone a lot of the time.
Yeah. If you're neurodivergent and you're trying to function in our culture, it's almost unavoidable. Like until you really learn how your system works and a set of skills to manage that, it's almost unavoidable that you're going to end up in burnout. As somebody once said, the system doesn't work for anybody. It doesn't work for neurotypical people either. They're just a little bit more resilient. Like the neurodivergent people are the canaries in the coal mine and they're falling off the perch right now.
Wow, it's a powerful statement. I'm curious to know more about the skills themselves. We let me see, how can I put this? Yeah, you talked about corporate consulting, business management, burnouts, but you're an emotional intelligence expert. So what led to the emotional intelligence journey? Can you tell us a bit about that?
Well, it's arose basically because I started traveling. I'd always intended to travel at a certain point in my life. And so I was traveling, and when you're traveling, I didn't even try to get corporate work, when I was traveling. Uh, the thing that I found that I had that people found useful was a lot of understanding of relationships and communication and that kind of area. And I found myself in demand with travelers and digital nomads and people in international communities to help people navigate their relationships, whether that was having mediated conversations with people or just working with individuals to manage their own intense reactions to what their partner was or wasn't doing. And in the course of doing that over a few years, I realized that I was explaining the same basic information to people over and over and over and over. There were certain basic things that if people didn't have that understanding and that skill set, it would just cause problems. And if I could just explain it to them and get them to practice and build that skill, they would then just not have those problems anymore. And so that's where I started actually making little video trainings, because I was sort of a lot of people had tight money. And so I'd say to them, look, rather than me explaining this to you for 20 minutes, go watch the video in between our sessions and then we can talk about it next time. So it made it more efficient to think of it more as training for people, rather than to think of it in a medical term like some form of therapy that I was doing to people. Very clear I wasn't doing therapy with people. I was simply teaching them stuff, teaching them skills, getting them to practice them at home until they were actually really good at them. And having those skills solved a lot of problems or prevented a lot of problems.
Amazing. Yeah, can you tell us more about the skills themselves? Like if you
Well,
had to summarize, I mean, obviously we can't summarize your entire knowledge base in the next 5 or 10 minutes. But yeah, if you can
yeah,
give kind of the
we can
highlights.
pick some examples. So a foundational skill is emotional regulation. So when you have feelings, those feelings contain information, and you need to use that information to direct your life, make decisions, move away from things that are bad for you, move towards things that are good for you, all that kind of stuff. So you need to have access to those feelings. You need to be able to feel them. If those feelings are too quiet, then basically you're lost. And that's how I was when I was running on adrenaline. I didn't feel anything really, except for really intense emotions like anger and really, really intense anger, and not even fear. I didn't even really feel much fear, um, that I noticed consciously. But because I wasn't feeling most of what was going on consciously, I was completely unaware if my body could have been giving me all the signals that a person was unsafe and that a person couldn't be trusted, and I wouldn't pick up those signals. So then that I would then trust that person, and then they would let me down or take advantage of me. Um, and so you need to be able to tune into those feelings, make sure they're loud enough to be felt. But on the other hand, some people feel them too loudly. And so their system gives them a warning, and suddenly it's so intense, like they can't think, they can't talk, they just feel like they have to like run out of the room. Um, or they can't concentrate on whatever task they're trying to do, then obviously that's not good. Like if it's too loud, it's not good either. If it's too quiet, it's not good. If it's too loud, it's not good. So you need to be able to adjust the volume, basically the volume dial on the feeling information that you're getting from your body. And being able to do that is a skill that you can learn and practice. And as you can imagine, if you're in an intimate relationship with somebody, and every time they come to talk to you about something that you've done that bothered them, you have a massive emotional reaction and a meltdown, and you can't continue the conversation. Like, that's not good for the relationship. So just being able to manage just purely the intensity of your emotions is already a game changer for a lot of people. And then once you have that skill and you are aware of what's going on, being able to identify the repeating patterns you have that are driven by feelings. You have an uncomfortable feeling, and then you're at the fridge pulling out a Tim Tam, or you're at the um, computer playing a game, or you're scrolling your phone when you should be asleep. All of these types of things are also driven by emotions. So once you're aware of them, then you can go, okay, well, just before I did that, what was I feeling? And you can work those feelings, get the information from them, release them from your system, and then you don't have to do the bad habit over and over and over. So there's a whole bunch of self-management type skills like that. That once you master them, the world is just a different place.
Sounds incredible. Yeah, I really resonate with that. And for context for the listener, I've actually been through some of Jenny's trainings as a complementary skill set for my own. And yeah, it really helped build a lot of the foundations that have helped me get to the place where I am now. I'm curious to know, Jenny, um, how do we actually start to become more aware of our emotions when we don't necessarily notice them? Like, what's that learning curve like?
Well, and it might sound counterintuitive, but the first step is actually to master the skill of turning down the volume on your emotions. And the reason why I say this is that often we're preventing ourselves from feeling the emotions because we have a fear that they'll be too much for us. It's like if it's going to be too much, I'm not even going to let it start. Um, and so once you have the confidence that you can dial it down, it's not going to overwhelm you, it's not going to be too much. That in itself can be enough for some people to just allow the information to start to flow. Others need to make more conscious effort. So once you're confident that you can manage and regulate your emotions, and if you have a big emotion that you can calm down, then to just sit for a few minutes each day and open up a space where if your system wanted to give you a sensation, it would be able to. It doesn't have to. And just the practice of doing that for a few minutes a day gradually communicates to your subconscious that you're interested in this information and you want it and you're making. And
Wow, that
the all-time record so far that I've had is somebody who practiced that every day for 8 weeks
eight weeks of practice before what?
before he started to actually feel his feeling information, like before he was consciously aware of what was
O-
happening with
Okay.
his emotions.
Wow.
But
And
that's the longest it's taken anybody
okay, that was my next
that
question.
in my,
Was
of
it the
all the
record
people I
long
know.
or short? So that eight weeks
Yeah, that
of
was the
opening
record
up that
long time.
space.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's incredible.
Yeah.
'Cause I definitely relate to being one of those peoples who would say, I don't feel emotions. I've actually had ex-girlfriends
Hmm.
say that I'm a robot, and it kind of makes me think there might be
Hmm.
some autistic in me. But yeah, it's I'm slowly, yeah, I'm on that learning curve right now.
Hmm. Yeah.
Um,
It's
yeah.
always a journey. Like no matter how much somebody is already consciously aware of things that are happening in their system, there is always 10 times more happening below the surface than whatever you're consciously aware of. So it doesn't matter how well you know yourself and how much you're aware of what's going on. There's always more you can find out about yourself if you take your time to open up that space.
That's a really incredible insight that I'm sure anybody who's listening can benefit from. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I'm curious to know what else, other than emotional intelligence and the whole journey that you've done around that. has helped you become the person that you've become today?
Well, I guess it's not strictly emotional intelligence. Some of the things that I've done that would come more under the heading of spiritual practice, like Buddhist type teachings and meditation and things like that, Vipassana, um, those kinds of things have also helped. But when I go into those practices and I watch what's happening, I don't really find that they're that different from what I'm talking about with my clients. My whole purpose with my clients is to have them be more aware and more present and more embodied. So I guess some spiritual practices are about getting away from your body and like they see the spiritual and the material as being two separate and unrelated domains, and you need to get out of the material domain and away from your body. But I've never really been drawn to those kinds of spiritual practices. I'm much more interested in the embodied awareness type spiritual practices like the Buddhist Vipassana meditations and the tantric meditations. So those kinds of things just dovetailed very, very well with the things that I was doing on the from the psychology side. For me, I feel like it's a continuum that a lot of the things that people are seeking to accomplish through spiritual practice can also be accomplished through tuning and mastering your human system and getting it to run really, really well. Then you can access states of altered consciousness that other people access through spiritual practices.
Interesting. Yeah, there's a couple of threads that I want to unpack there. The first one being what's the idea behind getting into altered states of consciousness? Like what is the appeal
So,
or what's the benefit from your perspective?
uh, how would I say that? Uh, so we have like we exist and we experience the world through a brain and a body, that brain and body. And those experiences are generated by patterns of neural activity. We have neurons not only in our brain, but also around our heart and around our gut. And 80% of the serotonin in your body is actually in your torso, not in your head. So we have an integrated system that is producing these experiences. And one of the things that happens when people start doing a bunch of spiritual practice in a really dedicated way is that their experience of inhabiting the body starts to shift. So the patterns of neural activity start to shift. And we call that an altered state of consciousness because it doesn't feel the same as everyday awareness. We all experience our own versions of altered states of consciousness. There are multiple states of consciousness that are normal, that the normal person is experiencing. Like, for example, if you lie down in bed to go to sleep and you're all very tense and wound up and you're still thinking about the problems at work, it's going to be very difficult to fall asleep. But if you shift into an altered state of consciousness where you have more alpha waves in your brain activity and fewer beta waves, then you're more relaxed and your body is more susceptible and it's easier to go into a state of sleep. But that very relaxed state that you go into is actually an altered state of consciousness. And there's a whole body of work called the Silva Method around using that altered state of deep relaxation to actually change the habitual patterns of neural activity in your brain. So altered states of consciousness give you an opportunity to reprogram or repattern the way that your brain activity operates in your more normal, more often experienced states of consciousness.
Interesting. Yeah, that maps a lot to some of the trainings that I did in flow, which are about managing different or having an awareness of different states of consciousness and leveraging that in our day to day in order to be more effective, just basically
Mhm.
being more aligned with what does this task require. Would you say that our defaults, like what you referred to as normal consciousness, waking consciousness, would be the default mode network or the ego, or either one or both?
I tend to steer away from the term ego just because different people mean very different things when they use that term.
Yeah, fair.
Um, the the default mode network is clearly defined pattern of activity that goes on in the brain. And I think it's important for us Westerners to understand that spending most of the day in a high level of beta wave activity with our default mode network buzzing away is for us the common experience. This is what we in the West do most of the day. We work all day in a
Yeah.
state where we have to be alert and on and solving problems and being analytical. But that's not normal in the sense of, as a species, the way that we lived our lives before agriculture and industrialization, we did not spend 8, 10, 12 hours a day in that highly amped up, adrenalized, analytical state. We would pop into that state when there was an actual problem that we needed to solve, which might happen 3 or 4 times a week. And for the rest of the week, we would actually be in the alpha dominant state. So, what we consider to
Interesting.
be normal now is not historically normal for humans.
Yeah, what you say there is really, really interesting to me because one of my big milestones in my personal development, emotions, and trauma journey was actually reading the book by Gabor Mate called The Myth of Normal. And in that book,
Mm-hmm,
he basically argues that the society, especially Western society, is completely anti-normal. It's actually toxic for health, but we've
mm-hmm,
normalized
mm-hmm.
it. And this is exactly the point that you're making.
Mm. Yeah, there's a story about when the Dalai Lama visited the big Buddhist community in the US. And one of the leaders of that community asked a question and said, we have a lot of people in our community who really struggle with loving themselves. They don't love themselves. And how do we help those people? And the Dalai Lama asked them to translate the question several times because couldn't believe that they were actually saying what he thought they were saying. And eventually he understood that no, really, this was actually a problem
Yeah,
because it wasn't a problem in the community in which he had grown up because child rearing practices were completely different there. And a baby would be in somebody's arms for most of the first year of its life, very rarely not in touch contact with another human. And as a result, their brain development was different. And they had a fundamental substrate of feeling worthy and feeling loved and feeling safe that Westerners who are raised in with the practices that you and I are familiar with often just do not have. And
wow,
once
yeah,
he understood what the teachers were asking, he said, you actually have people who don't love themselves. They were like, yes, many. And he's like, well, that's obviously the first thing you need to solve. Like all of the Buddhist practices
yeah,
that come afterwards are not going to work if the person doesn't have the foundation of their psyche in place.
yeah.
And when I was hearing this story, and I had by this stage had my own experiences with helping people to learn these skills, I understood exactly why. because I guess the best way to put it is that you can't transcend a poorly formed ego. Again, I don't like to
Yeah.
use the word ego, but people talk about transcending their ego all the time
Mm.
in Eastern spirituality.
Yeah, it's a complex concept, the ego, and yeah, we don't need to
Yeah.
use the concept so much, but even um,
But even if we
yeah,
use the word psyche,
yeah,
right? Your
exactly.
psyche develops over time. It develops over the first 7 years of your life. We're born very unformed,
Yeah.
very immature in comparison with other mammals. And so our brain does a lot of development after we're born, and therefore it's very influenced by our environment. And if you have the foundation in place and you have a well-formed psyche, then you feel safe enough to stop identifying with that psyche. There's a form of safety that exists outside of your self-concept. You can let go of your self-concept and still sense a self. You have a sense of self which is independent of your self-concept. And for a lot of people in the West, they have a concept of themselves, which is language based and analytical and conceptual, but they don't have a felt sense of self that will sustain them in letting go of all of that language based self concept.
Wow, that's a really beautiful explanation that the way you framed it in terms of psyche and self-concept, yeah, is really beautiful, and I think it ties together the spiritual practices and even the goal of enlightenment, if that is a goal that people have, with the whole biological basis of brain from neural developments from very, very far back infancy, and even um, yeah, even things that even development that happens before birth. I know that if parents are stressed, and living in modern day society is stressful already in and of itself,
Mm-hmm.
then the baby's brain development is not going to be as ideal as it should be per our nature per yeah.
Mm. I do want to jump in here and say that it
Please.
used to be the case that we used to believe that what's done is done. And if something messed up in your first 7 years and your psyche is bent, tough buns, you've just got to live with it. But we now know that we have neuroplasticity throughout our entire life. And so it's never too late to build a well balanced psyche. You can, at any age, go back and rewire the foundations of your psyche to be what they should have been all along and what they would have been if you had grown up in a better environment.
Yeah, that's a really great point. Yeah, thank you for calling that out. I'm curious to know now, what do you believe are the root reasons behind neurodivergence in general? And maybe this is too big of a question, so if you want to kind of focus on specific labels or conditions, we can do that, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts.
Well, we know that it's genetic. We know that there's multiple factors because some forms of neurodivergence, particularly later diagnosed ones, are associated with particular genetic combinations, whereas the early diagnosed ones are not associated with those same genetic combinations. There's a lot of research out there now that gives us an idea of the biological underpinnings. And we also know that there's a lot of overlap between ADHD and autism and other forms of neurodivergence. So, um, it's genetic and there's a lot of overlap. I think it's worth thinking of neurodivergence as a thing, even though there are different parts of it that are diagnosed differently, and there are different ways that you need to manage yourself based on which combinations of characteristics that you have. It's worth thinking about it there being types. But evolutionarily, we know that the um, the neurodivergent cluster um, co-emerged with our high intelligence. So at the in evolutionary processes, there are certain capabilities that we have that can, like in some individuals, they go into the realm of what's called neurodivergence. In other individuals, they just get called gifted. And some people say, well, gifted is a form of neurodivergence. And other people are like, no, gifted people are worthy and good, and neurodivergent people are problematic and bad. Um, but I think that there's just a spectrum of individual differences, but they have pinpointed certain mutations and certain types of genetic things that have given us an edge as a species. They've allowed us to do creative problem solving and to learn how to do something just by watching someone else do it, which is a freaking fantastic ability to have. And it's taken us a long way. But in gaining those capabilities, we also gained levels of sensitivity that in certain environments are really not helpful. And as a species, we've carried on to develop our average environment into something that's less and less suitable for those sensitivities and those more extreme versions of neurodivergence. Not to say that historically things were great if you were non-verbal autistic in a little family group in a hunter-gatherer society somewhere. I'm not saying that life was all roses and sunshine, but in a natural environment, generally, somebody who's neurodivergent is more comfortable than in a built environment trying to operate according to clocks and alarms and with all of the excessive visual stimulation and noise that we have in cities and large densities of humans. Just not the best environment for a lot of neurodivergent folk.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. To what extent do you think we can control it or like change our environments? And perhaps as opposed to um our environment being a way to cope with difficult emotional signals on the inside of us that we may or may not be conscious of. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think there are two ways of looking at this. One is if you look at the parents who know that they themselves are neurodivergent and therefore their children are likely to be neurodivergent and who have the education and resources to shape the environment their children are in, then you see a different presentation of neurodivergence from what we historically understand it to have been, and when we were back in primary school. And it's to the point where sometimes it's difficult for these parents to get an official diagnosis for their children because their children are too happy. And when someone who is neurodivergent is in an environment that suits them and they're happy and comfortable, they don't display a lot of the distress behaviors that are listed in the DSM as part of the diagnostic criteria for autism or ADHD. So if you do a good enough job of providing the right kind of environment for a neurodivergent individual, you can make it to the point where a professional may refuse to diagnose them with neurodivergence at all.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And it really questions then the whole narrative or assumption that people have about neurodivergence being some kind of broken or issue with people. Um, because
Hmm.
yeah,
Yeah.
if we could just be in the right environment and if we can learn the right skills, then we're just looking at the world from a neurodiversity perspective, from the fact that yes, we all have different brains, and that's great. There's nothing else to say about it. We all need different kinds of environments. We all have different preferences, and we all, have different strengths and weaknesses. And it's no different than physical characteristics like being blonde and blue-eyed versus being, dark hair and brown eyes. It's just different.
Hmm. It's even worse than that, actually, or even more than that.
Yeah.
When they have set up a classroom in a way that really suits the neurodivergent kids in a mixed classroom. So you've got neurotypical kids, but you've also got 3 or 4 neurodivergent kids. And they've gone and set up the entire classroom so that it is suitable for those neurodivergent kids with the lighting, with the sound, with the signaling, plenty of advance warning of changes from one task to another, and all of the things that help to support neurodivergent kids. The neurodivergent kids do learn way better in those classrooms, but the neurotypical kids also learn better in those classrooms. So it's not that the
Interesting.
standard classroom is suitable for the neurotypical kids. It's not actually suitable for the neurotypical kids either, but they have more resilience. They have more ability to continue to do what the adults want in an unsuitable environment. And the neurodivergent kids are just less able to keep up with the requirements of the adults as the environment becomes less suitable.
That's super
What that
interesting.
suggests, though, is that we would
Yeah.
all be happier and we would all be more productive if the world was a more humane place to be in.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, intuitively, that makes a lot of sense. And one of the thoughts that crossed through my system as you were sharing that was, what if there is no such thing as neurotypical? I mean, when you say that if the classroom is designed for divergent kids and everybody does better, what that whispers inside of me is, what if everybody is neurodivergent as we talk about it in different forms and to different degrees, but the group that we call neurotypical might just not be detected or might be coping with it a little bit better for whatever reasons it may be. But I'm curious to know what you think
Hmm.
about that idea.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I don't see humanity as being able to be categorized into very separate buckets on any dimension, really.
Yeah, that's fair.
We have a continuum of heights, and we have a continuum of weights, and we have a continuum of food sensitivities, and there's just all of these continua. And this is just another one. We have some people who have very visible, extreme amounts of a particular part of the neurodivergent spectrum. Maybe they are non-verbal, they don't speak, or they have very extreme dyslexia and dyscalculia, and so they can't do the normal classroom stuff in the way that a neurotypical kid would do them. But some people are better at that stuff and some people are worse at that stuff. And some people are going through the school system and they're getting, 90 to 100% on mathematics and 20 and 30% on their essay writing, and others are getting it the other way round. And that you can
Yeah.
look at that and go, yes, this is just the spectrum of human difference. But those who do have the more extreme versions of neurodivergence, those whose distractibility and impulsivity, for example, with their ADHD, are very strong and very disruptive. Uh, for those people, it can be invalidating to say, oh, everybody is a little bit neurodivergent because the degree of it that most people have is something that's not going to get them punished. It's not going to have them having bad consequences. It's not going to affect their health. It's not going to affect their earning capacity. And so, for the people who do have more difficulty in specific parts of the spectrum, it can be disturbing to hear the maybe everybody's a little bit neurodivergent version of way of
Yeah.
looking at things.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks for sharing that perspective. And yeah, I guess if there are these labels, including neurotypical versus neurodivergent, then there's some good reasons behind why that is. So I appreciate you sharing that.
Yeah, I mean, for some people, they really do need the support of the medication that is available for ADHD, even though it is a blunt instrument, and even though we don't have like a really great medication for it yet. But for a lot of people, the medications that are available are a game changer and make the difference for them in being able to, keep make a living and keep a relationship together versus just failing at everything and being miserable and depressed. So being able to have a category and then meet the conditions for the category and get a diagnosis and get a medication can for some people be an absolute life-changing, thing that they would never want to take away from anybody.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. There's yeah, just such a wide range of cases and a wide range of solutions needed in parallel to environments and skills.
Mm.
I would love
Yeah,
to
and what
know, yeah,
part of the problem, of course, is that most of the solutions that uh, we have that we know work are very labor-intensive, non-pharmaceutical uh, things, which are expensive and insurance companies don't want to pay for, and therefore there's pressure on the psychiatric profession to put people into the categories that can be medicated and then to medicate them, even if they would be better off with skills training.
and what would be some of the examples of those like more costly or difficult solutions?
Well, things like the training that I do with people, the courses that
Yeah,
I run for people, those are not covered by any government's, public health system. They're not covered by insurance companies. People have to pay out of pocket to learn those skills because the they're viewed as training programs. They're viewed as education. They're not viewed as medicine, even
yeah,
though the effect of learning these skills is completely therapeutic and changes people's experience of being alive and changes people's ability to manage their life in exactly the same ways that medicating some people has that life-changing effect. Developing these skills for other people has the same kind of life-changing effect. But
yeah.
medicine is recognized as a thing that governments and insurance companies will pay for, and skills training usually is not.
Yeah, that makes sense. So self-development and just yeah, learning more can have a compounded effect on rewiring your system in a similar scale than taking medication can have. And of course, it depends on
Mm.
what skills and it depends what medication and all these different things. But fundamentally, from a concept perspective, we can, yeah, we can change our brains, our nervous systems by the thoughts that we have, the habits that we do, and being consistent with that, if I understand you correctly.
Yeah, absolutely. I have um, someone who's done my full training program who said that they had been diagnosed with ADHD and bipolar, and they said that their mental health symptoms were 1% of what they had been before they did the training program. They still took their medications, but the they had previously been taking the medication and still having a lot of life disturbing symptoms. And by
Yeah.
learning the skills, their life disturbing symptoms went down to just a tiny, tiny little fraction of what they previously had been.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me, and it really mirrors my own journey with mania and bipolar diagnosis as well. Um, so I'm curious to know if somebody, well, let's say I am here, I might be neurodivergent, I'm not me, I'm maybe a past version of you that doesn't know the same amount as you do now, or um,
Mm-hmm.
so a listener coming from the podcast who is interested in finding these kind of alternative solutions to their life struggles, mental symptoms, understanding themselves better, whether it's with labels or just understanding the lack of skills and bridging those gaps. What would you kind of recommend to them overall? What would you say to them asking for help?
Well, I would say, yeah, yeah. Look, I have a website, which is jennyhale.org, and I put on there whatever I can, as much as possible, free of charge, short courses and information and blog posts and things that contain all of this information. So I would say that is the starting point. Just go there. I've got a book on Amazon. You'll be able to find a link to that from the website. And so if you want a book, there's a book. If you want video courses, there's video courses. And just start somewhere. And with whatever it is that is front of mind for you at the moment, and then gradually explore all of the other options and the other skills that are available.
Yeah, thank you for sharing those resources, and it's really lovely to have um free stuff accessible so that people can actually start to improve their own way before going deeper into the work in whatever ways are relevant for them. Um
Yeah,
before
and we
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 yeah,
now have an app as well, so that people can
beautiful.
actually get the courses on the smartphone or mobile device, and don't have to be sitting at the computer anymore. So, and that's at app.jennyhale.org. Uh, so if you'd
Amazing.
rather have it on your smartphone rather than sitting at a computer, then we have that option as well.
Amazing. The links will be down below. Jenny, before we wrap up the conversation, any are there any topics or things, skills, tools, whatever comes up to mind that you haven't mentioned yet that you'd like to share?
I think one of the things that is is pivotal and that most people need to hear when they're early on in their process of understanding neurodivergence and figuring themselves out is that our culture usually has us feel like there's something wrong with us, that we are somehow too much or not enough or both at the same time or broken in some way, that we can't do things the way everyone expects us to or the way other people do them. And the thing I think that is most important for people to understand is, even though it feels like that, even though it feels like there's something wrong with you and it feels like you're too much or not enough or broken or whatever, those feelings are not facts. And the fact is that you have a body and a brain. Everybody has a body and a brain. And there's a set of rules that they work by. And no matter what your individual differences, you can still learn what the rules are and you can improve the functioning of your body and brain to who knows what extent, some people more, some people less, but way more than you imagine you can, and way more than our culture tells you that you can. I was just on a call today with some people who just did a mentorship with me this year. And one of them was saying that it's revolutionary, but he has the experience now that he has the choice about how he responds to his parents doing the stuff his parents have always done, and that he doesn't have to always react the way he's always reacted. Like, so this is unheard of. Like, this is revolutionary. This, like, none of the people in my extended family understand that they have a choice. And even if I tell them they have a choice, they don't get that they have a choice. Like, the understanding that you can change your system and you can change the way it reacts to things, even if you don't feel like you can, just knowing that you can is a very, very important starting point for everybody. If you don't know it's possible, you don't have to go looking for how.
Yeah. Yeah. And from one of the things that I learned training in flow is that if you don't believe it's possible, then your mind and body as a combination isn't gonna expend the energy in trying, because it's rather gonna
Mm-hmm.
save that energy if it feels
Mm,
like it's not possible. So
mm,
that belief is such a huge, that hope that change is possible, and believing enough to just explore and take those first steps to really investigate and learn new things is absolutely key.
mm-hmm. Once you've learned a little bit and one thing has shifted for you, that's enough usually for most people to just get the bit between their teeth and really go for it. It's like having that first taste. So it's a matter of going on faith for long enough to get that first taste of something really having changed.
Yeah, amazing. Well, Jenny, thank you so much for everything that you've shared. To anybody who wants to check out some of Jenny's stuff, the links will be in the biography. And yeah, thanks again, Jenny, for sharing all of these really deep insights, practical, actionable tools, and thank you for being such a great guest.
It's an absolute pleasure. Thanks for having me on, Anthony. And thanks for doing the podcast. I'm sure it's going to change a lot of lives.
With great pleasure.